My name's Michael Steed. I've been a trustee of the McDougall Trust since the year 2007, and one of the most interesting and worthwhile roles that I played in that time was kicking off this series of workshops, and I've had the privilege of chairing the majority of them. And I got Paul Wilder, the chap who's sitting over there, who's our administrative secretary, to check the record. This is actually the 44th since we started. 2 of them were in Australia, all the rest in this country, but 1 in Manchester. We started in Chancel Street, which for the historians amongst you will know that in the dim and distant dark ages we shared with the Electoral Reform Society. And we've moved to these premises. We've covered an amazing range of topics, and the list is on our website for anybody who's looking at this via the internet, and they can check out the list. Many of our workshops are linked with articles which have appeared in our journal representation, and some, like this, are videoed and will be permanently, I trust, available on our workshop. On our website. We started with a very historical topic linked to a piece of research that we sponsored, the history and experience of a fascinating experiment in the use of the single transferable vote in New York City Council elections. And it looks as if the United States of America still needs to reconsider the functioning of its electoral arrangements today. We've moved on now in time, as well as numbers of workshops, to something which is perhaps obviously very much more looking at the future, the pros and the cons of electronic or e-voting. This is the final workshop of 2016. I'd like to be able to just announce to friends here that I will be standing down as a trustee sometime during 2017, so this may or may not be the final workshop which I personally chair. What the format today is that each of our 2 speakers is going to speak for 15 minutes. We've guaranteed them a reply period of 5 minutes each, but we're talking amongst ourselves. We think it would be nice to start off with the 2 15 minutes, then throw it over to the audience, and then decide at what stage to come in for the riposte. On my left, your right, and this will get even more confusing later on my left, your right, is Areeq Chowdhury, who's going to kick off the debate. On my right, your left, is Jason Kitcat. Since when we change over, Jason is going to move to my left and Areeq to my right, because the place from which to speak is here. This may get confusing, but I think we're probably able to cope with that. Areeq, those of you who've had the blurb will know this, is the chief executive of a think tank, WebRoots Democracy, the Institute for Digital Democracy, which is researching the internet and political participation, which was his student topic. And at a remarkably young age of 21, he founded this think tank. He's probably the youngest chief executive of a think tank in Europe. If he isn't, this is a challenge to somebody watching to let him know that there is another one still younger. So he's young, forward-looking, and is going to put the case, as I understand it, for e-voting. Areeq.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks for doing a workshop on this topic. I think it's very, very important in our democracy in this day and age. So just a little bit more about myself and our organisation. So basically, sorry, can you hear me now? Better? Yeah?
You project.
Sorry, thank you.
Be helpful.
Cool. So WebRoots Democracy started off as a campaign group specifically on online voting, trying to campaign to get it as an option alongside the current methods of voting in UK elections. And the driving factor behind that was the sort of decline in youth voter participation, which in general elections has been below 50% for every general election since 2000. And in non-general elections, it's much, much worse. So today, I'm going to focus primarily on sort of the security aspects of online voting. This is by far the biggest challenge to this reform. I'm sure Jason will touch on a lot of those issues in more detail than I will. But to start off with, I want to talk about the current context. So you might not be able to read that, but they're basically two tweets by the next president of the US, Donald Trump, and I'll read them out. So the first one is, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. And the second one is, serious voter fraud in Virginia, New Hampshire, and California. So why isn't the media reporting on this? Serious bias, big problem. And the reason why this is important to touch upon, because we're in a time now where people, not just the public, distrust politics, but the next leader of the free world is driving this distrust of politics and is questioning the sort of legitimacy of our voting system that isn't, in America, isn't online in particular. So America has a very different system to ours. That's to sort of give a context to where we are and really sort of hammer home the fact that we are in a sort of democracy in crisis. The establishment are scared, and you don't need to describe any further. So this presentation basically is going to be a series of quotes. I'm just going to talk about each quotes from different people. And the first one is by Confucius. I'll read this one out. So it says, "He who says he can and he who says he can't are both usually right." And the reason I say that is because I feel with this subject of online voting, we kind of have a very pessimistic attitude towards it in terms of debate. It seems to be a very much a sort of doomsday scenario. If we have online voting, all of the votes will be hacked. Everyone will know how you voted. We'll never be able to trust an election ever again. Elections will be bought. And that's the sort of he who says he can't attitude to it. Whereas I feel like we should have a he who says he can attitude. And we should really look towards sort of addressing those issues, but sort of working our way towards getting to that stage of having online voting. Because if you look at the world around us now, we can't afford to not do this. If you look around, you're more likely, I think, to talk to your friends every day online than you would be able to talk to them in person. And just everything we're doing now is digital. I think 95% of young people in the UK today use the internet on the go. So that's when they're walking around every day. And it doesn't really seem to make sense that we have such a pessimistic attitude towards technology when the rest of society outside of politics has a very, very optimistic attitude towards it. And this next quote is from the outgoing president, who I'm sure we will miss compared to the new incoming one. And he is a supporter of online voting in America. He describes it as being a priority moving forward for people involved in politics and also in technology. And speaking on this issue, he says this, which is, "It's much easier for you to order a pizza than it is for you to exercise the single most important task in democracy, and that's for you to elect who's going to represent you in government." And what he's saying here is, it's not necessarily about, people being, people say, oh, young people are just lazy, or people are just lazy, why should we put it online? Why can't they just go out there and vote? In reality, what Obama is talking about here is making it accessible. It should be easy to vote. It should be something that isn't considered to be a hurdle in your day-to-day life. And in particular, the people who are most disenfranchised from our election system are people, not young people, although that's why I started this campaign, I realised it's not actually young people who are going to be the biggest winners out of online voting. It's people with disabilities and people with vision impairments. So if you have a housebound disability, you have to rely on someone else to cast your vote. Even if that's a postal vote, that person will have to go to the post box and post that vote. If you have a vision impairment, there's no way you can independently vote without having to rely on someone else. And in terms of this as an accessibility issue, this is so important that we look at different ways of doing things and looking at technology to do so. I mean, a lot of charities who support this. So Scope, which is a disability charity, have called for this reform on a number of occasions. And the Royal London Society for the Blind have also been campaigning to have an online voting option implemented in elections. And this next quote is from Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. He's another supporter of online voting, and he says this: "If we are serious about raising turnout at elections and getting more people involved with the way our country is run, then we need to do all we can to drag our democracy into the 21st century." Again, that's making that point. We're all living our lives digitally now, and the fact of the matter is this: in 2020, for the first time, there'll be 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are first-time voters who are born in this millennium. And what does that mean? That means that they are voters who have known nothing other than a society of Facebook, Twitter, and iPhones. Facebook was founded in 2003. The first iPhone came out, I think, in 2005. And the reality is that we have a new digital culture in the UK. It seems ridiculous that in 2020 we're going to be expecting people to do stuff that they'll probably never really do in their day-to-day life. I wouldn't be surprised if there are people in 2020 voting for the first time who have never posted a letter in their life. Why should they have to? By that point, we'll be even more digital, and that's the way the government's going as well, in terms of digital by default. So really, this reform is about sort of moving elections with the population and making sure that we have a system that is not as it is now, which is increasingly alien to the next generation and the generation after that. This quote here is from Jenny Watson, who is the chair of the Electoral Commission. It's again someone who has called for online voting in elections. And she says this: "This is not an issue that can stay on the slow track any longer." And that's what she's saying there, is that this is an issue that a lot of politicians have accepted is going to be the future. The government's line on this is, they don't rule it out. They think that this is going to happen. They think it's inevitable. But in terms of action, nothing has been done in terms of real, concrete movement, not for a long time anyway in this country, in terms of putting this onto the agenda and making this happen. Sorry. And she, of course, is someone who studies a lot of these things. She recognises that there are risks involved, but ultimately she thinks the benefits outweigh those risks. And that's the same view, I believe, the Electoral Commission take on postal voting. This quote is from Mark Bregman, who is the former Chief Technology Officer at Symantec, which is a giant multinational security company. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of your computers use that technology. And he argues this. He says the psychology is, I don't understand digital, it's complex, so it'll be delayed. And what he's saying is that he doesn't believe it's a technological issue that's stopping this from happening. He thinks it's psychological, in that you read all these stories in the news, this website got hacked, this website got hacked. You understand the doomsday scenarios, all of these votes can be changed, what will happen and this. So for his point of view, it's, and this is a guy, who is at the top in terms of global sort of security knowledge. This is a guy who believes it's not a technological barrier. It's more that we as people are more reluctant to trust the internet. That's understandable. But the point he makes is that it's not a technological barrier for this happening. And this quote is from Gary Davis, who's the Vice President at Intel Security, another massive multinational security company. Their technology is in almost every computer in the world. And he says this: "It's worth pointing out that there are acceptable levels of risk for any secure system, and that there's no reason to believe an online system of voting would have greater risks than our current voting system." And I can understand what he's saying here. So I should have said this at the beginning, but my background is I started in project management in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, where I worked on this broadband rollout, and a lot of that is to do with risk management. And I was also an auditor at KPMG in Canary Wharf. And what Gary Davis is talking about here is that there are risks in every project, online and offline. We tend to look at this issue in a silo, that we should have 100% security, and if we can't achieve that, we can't do it. But what project would you approach in that manner? Nothing. There's literally nothing in the world that you would approach in the same manner. Take, for example, if you were to get on a plane, very, very safe. Is it 100% secure? No, of course not. And the consequences are devastating, much more devastating than with internet voting. So the issue here is more of sort of risk management and approaching it really like you would approach any sort of, not just online projects, but offline projects, making a building, doing infrastructure projects. There's lots of risks involved. And what he's saying here is that there's no more risk in the current system. In the current system, in postal voting, the only thing that secures your vote is a gummed envelope. So this next quote, because I'm getting a bit short on time. This next quote is from Dr. Kevin Curran, who's a reader in computer science. And he says, audit trails for online voting systems can be implemented, as is done for financial organizations and others who deal with critical information. There's another quote here from Professor Robert Krimmer, who's a professor of e-governance at Tallinn University of Technology. He says, a scenario where online voting systems record how someone has voted and leaking their identity is very unlikely. And these next quotes, to finish off with, are just quotes that a lot of experts at these periods of time sort of predicted about future technological advances. And this one here is from Dr. Dionysius Lauder, who's a professor in natural philosophy in 1800. He said, rail travel at high speed is not possible because passengers unable to breathe would die of asphyxia. Edwin Drake was the first American to successfully drill for oil, and his associate said, drill for oil? You mean drill in the ground to find oil? That's crazy. Simon Newcomb, who was an astronomer and mathematician in 1900. Flights by machines heavier than air is unpractical and insignificant, if not utterly impossible. Darrell Zanuck, who is from 20th Century Fox. Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. Ken Olson, president of Digital Equipment Corporation. There is no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. Clifford Stoll, a Newsweek journalist. The truth is no online database will replace your daily newspaper. And you can see the theme here. The theme here is that there have been a lot of people who say we can't do something, and they've all been proven wrong, which is why I think with this issue, we need to take an optimistic viewpoint towards this. I mean, there are many people who have skepticism of online security. For WebRoots Democracy, we have an advisory council which has 6 leading computer science voices. One of them, Professor Mark Ryan, is a well-known expert in this field. He's very cautious of security, but he does not believe it's impossible. He thinks we should carry on working towards making that happen. And this statistic here is what I want to leave you with, is that 95% of the UK's 19,000 elected politicians were voted in on turnouts of less than 50%. That, in my view, is not acceptable in a modern democracy, the mother of all parliaments. And I think this is why online voting is not a panacea, by the way. I think it's one option amongst many, but I think it's a necessary function to have a proper functioning 21st century democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Areeq. You managed to actually, I think, get it into 14 minutes by my timepiece. Well done. Whilst Jason and Areeq are switching round, let me introduce Jason. He's Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Crunch, the United Kingdom's first and largest online accountancy firm, and has done many other much other work in building digital services, observing e-voting in Estonia and so forth. He's better known to me as a television viewer in the southeast of England, but also as somebody who tries to follow changes in politics, as the person who was pretty well known on the box in the southeast of England for a short period recently, when he was the Green Party leader of Brighton and Hove City Council. I think I'm right in saying that just as Areeq is the youngest chief executive of a think tank in Europe, so that between 2012 and 2014, Jason was the most significant power-exercising Green politician in Western Europe. He was actually overtaken in 2014, I'm chuntering on to give him time to get ready, by Areeq in Grenoble, who became mayor of Grenoble. And I think we've just agreed, Jason and I, that probably Areeq became a more significant Green politician in 2014. Anyway, I think are you now ready?
I'm ready.
Ready, Jason?
Going. This is fun.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me make one final point then, because there is a serious point out of that. There have been a remarkable number of electoral upsets this year and in the year or two beforehand. The main, what I think is undoubtedly the main theme of them, a populist, right-wing, authoritarian nationalist theme, has tended to be regarded by some commentators as the only common thread. What's happening in France is fascinating in that respect, because one of the most significant upsets in France was the victory in Grenoble for the Green Party, which hardly fits into the nationalist authoritarian grouping of parties. Anyway, Jason, carry on.
Thank you. I'm not a member of any party now, so but it is interesting to discuss. I believe I was also the youngest council leader at the time, but my youth has gone now.
Right.
So, yeah, thank you very much. Electronic voting. First of all, why should I talk about this? Well, back when I was doing my first degree in computer science and management science, I researched the use of technology in democracy, and I wrote GNU.free, which is the world's first open source voting system for the use in politically binding elections. So I don't come from this from a Luddite angle, I come at it actually from a technologist angle. I then work for the Open Rights Group as an e-voting coordinator, and I sit on the advisory councils for the Open Rights Group and Foundation for Internet Policy Research. I have been leader of a council, I have won elections, I have stood in elections, and I've published over 20 articles on this issue, including peer-reviewed ones, and I'm a professional member of the British Computer Society and the Association for Computing Machinery. I could address each one of the quotes that Areeq mentioned, but I don't think quotes are an argument personally. I mean, if you're building a house, do you get an interior designer to give you some comments, or do you speak to a structural engineer? You've got to focus on the reality here. This isn't about voting has to be hard. As Richard Allen, the former Sheffield MP, said, this isn't the broken glass theory of democracy. It doesn't have to be hard, but you need to do it right. And this isn't about optimism versus pessimism. It's about what are we trying to achieve, and then going, what are we going to do to achieve that outcome? If the problem is turnout, then I'm afraid technology isn't your solution. And I can summarize my argument quite simply. Just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's a good one, right? Not all new ideas and technologies are good. There are people who believed that we would go to the moon and Mars through the use of a pneumatic tube, launching a capsule to the moon in the form of a large gun. And this was in the 1800s. There were scientists who also claimed that there were, railway lines on Mars. So I could pick any quote you want to give you the answer you want. But we do need to recognize that elections are a unique and particularly difficult and challenging project. They're completely unlike online banking, online shopping, pretty much online anything else, and offline everything else. So first of all, we have laws and we have treaty obligations which require elections to have three properties. One, they have to be secure, so that when you cast your vote, it can't be altered, and that only people entitled to vote. It has to be verifiable, so that all the competing candidates and agents, and I see among you people who have stood for election who I recognise, Colin, you know what it's like. It's not about trust, it's the fact that we can all watch the election at the same time, we can see the special mark on the paper, and we can verify that these ballots were entitled to be cast. We can observe the roll and see who was on that roll and who has cast their ballot. But it's also anonymous. We cannot know how you voted. And the reason for that is quite simple, because for much of our history, and in many countries around the world, still sadly to this day, people get abused, bribed, beaten, and intimidated to vote in a certain way. And if your vote isn't secret, that continues. And we used to have the situation of treating, where your landlord or boss would give you a pre-filled ballot paper here in the UK until 1872, and you would have to go and use that pre-filled ballot if you wanted to stay in your home or keep your job, or both. And we were the last nation in the Commonwealth to introduce the secret ballot, much to our shame, because the king at the time said that a gentleman shouldn't have any fear about how their vote was cast. Anyway, times move on, and I know for the pedants among you who are going to say that our votes aren't truly secret in the UK because ballots are numbered, you're right, and we are in breach of the Human Rights Act, and I'm looking for a rich person to help me pay for a challenge to the courts on that. But for all practical purposes, votes are secret, and in the rest of the developed world, they are truly secret and anonymous. Now, what this means is that unlike e-commerce, you can't ask for a refund. How does one refund a vote that has been cast and counted and declared? And secondly, you can't have a receipt or a statement saying that this was how the transaction went. Whereas if you shop online and you go, actually, that wasn't me, or I didn't mean to do that, you can look at your statement and go, oh, that's not right. You can call the bank or credit card provider up and they can go, yes, I know who you are. I've got your address. I've got your name. I've got your birthday and your inside leg measurement. I'll refund you. You can't do that in votes, because then it would immediately be proof of how you voted, and you get back to the problem of it not being anonymous. Now, you can say, well, yeah, but their computers are clever and everything. But one of the unique properties about paper or shells or the other physical objects we used to vote with is they take space and they're hard to copy. Does anyone know how the fraudsters in Birmingham were caught trying to stuff the ballot boxes Do you know what caught them out? They had a warehouse full of paper ballots. Now, this USB stick can hold 1 million or 1 billion votes, and you would be none the wiser, because none of us can see inside it. We can't see the electrons in there, and we can't see how it's encoded. And we could quite easily stick it into a computer, and it could pretend to be empty. Very similar to the way that VW and Audi fooled the emissions testing. They knew when they were in test mode, and they knew when they weren't. So anyway, let's talk about some real-world examples. So it may amuse you to know that, again, being laggards, the UK was one of the last places in the world where you could actually observe elections legally. We would love to send people to observe elections elsewhere and tell them how to do it, but it wasn't until 2007 the Electoral Commission was given the power to accredit observers, and I led the first ever accredited observation mission in the UK. And we had 25 observers, including professors from Oxford and Cambridge, and we observed the use of e-voting and e-counting across Scotland and England. And I'm going to canter as quickly as I can through some examples. I'm going to canter through what I saw in Estonia and hopefully make it all in time. So in England, and you can read the full reports there that were published, there was about £100 million spent on pilots for e-voting and e-counting from the year 2000 to 2007. At the end of 2007, just to jump to the punch line, the Electoral Commission recommended we shouldn't really do this anymore. So Jenny Watson being quoted doesn't really matter because the rest of the Commission disagree with her. And she doesn't know anything about elections, to be blunt. Her job is to be a professional chair of Quangos. Love you, Jenny. So what does James Bond have to do with elections? Well, I spent a fun night in Pinewood Studios, which is where they film it, where South Bucks did their count, and the British government invited the Dutch government to observe this technological marvel. There's only one small problem. They couldn't get the result out. So we spent the night watching technicians from America reinstalling Windows to try and get the result out for the election. The returning officer didn't understand what was going on. The people from the Electoral Commission and the Ministry of Justice didn't understand what was going on. And it was all a bit awkward, so we ended up doing Tai Chi in the middle of the studio to keep warm because there was no food or drink. Eventually, a result was declared, and I have no idea if it was accurate or not, and no one else did. In Rushmore, can anyone spot the two errors on this ballot paper? This was a live ballot used in a legally binding election. Do you need a hint? Can I move, or is that going to cause problems? So you've got two Labour candidates. But actually, this guy wasn't Labour. He was Conservative, but he was put up as a Conservation Party candidate, which may be a new spin on the party, I don't know. That was actually used to cast 50 votes before someone thought they might tell someone about it. So whether that affected the outcome of the election, who knows? But they said, don't worry, we have a secure verification system. We FOI'd it, because most of the stuff we couldn't get without using FOI, and that's what they sent us. Well, that proves everything, doesn't it? My vote was soundly and correctly recorded, I'm sure of it. Now, someone could go, well, that's probably a hash algorithm, and I could mathematically prove the cryptography that was used to hash the vote that was cast and stored, and probably if I used homomorphic encryption, I could do a count without decrypting it. The problem is that your average punter isn't going to know what that means or trust, and the average voter, and the average party agent, and the average candidate. And that's why people like Donald Trump can make claims around millions of fraudulent votes, because with the e-counting system in America, no one knows what's true or not. Trust is very easily lost. And stuff like that, where some, propeller head can say, yeah, but I can prove it mathematically, doesn't give you trust in a voting system. Let's move on. Swindon. That was the internet connection used at a polling place. They had polling place internet voting. You went to your polling place, there's your card, sit at the laptop, please vote. Guess what? It didn't work. They didn't have a backup plan. So then we went to the polling centre where they were going to collate the votes. Lovely sports centre, brings back memories for many of you, I'm sure. Oh, look, there are the counting machines. Oh, look, there's another one. Oh, look, there are open doors, unsecured. Anyone could waltz in and have a play with them during the day because no one thought to secure them. So then we said, well, where are you storing the votes during the 2-week pre-voting period that you allowed with this trial? And they said, come to our data centre. We'll let you see everything. Great, let's go and have a look. That's what we saw. Because they showed us a locked box and go, it's in there. Trust us. What does that mean? I can see as much as I can see, in this or in this computer here. It means nothing. There's no trust built there. Well, let's talk a bit about e-counting. That's when you get a scanner to scan a paper ballot. So a lovely place called Bregman. We FOI'd them. I FOI'd every place. I've got a room full of the files we got from there. Here's the audit lock, which protects the voter because it means nothing could happen without it being tracked. So here are your entries. You've got scan start, scan start, scan end, scan start. So you've got 3 starts but only 1 end. and then someone logs in twice, and that was the end of the election. I asked the supplier, asked the returning officer, what does that mean? They didn't know. And then I said, well, how about a recount? And they did that, and they found 56.1% more votes when they counted it manually. Right? And this was a company called Indra, who are still being used in elections around the world, including in this country. I said, but it's faster, don't worry. So I did a little bit of math, and we looked at the speed of these counts. And so the election, that's when they started counting, and this is when they finished. So 15 hours, 2 days, 6 hours, 13 hours, 15 hours, 2 days. I can tell you most council elections are hand-counted much faster than that, in a matter of hours. So it wasn't faster. And I don't have time, but I could talk to you about London, because every year of a London mayoral and assembly elections, they've had problems with the e-counting. There's actually a case going on up the road right now with the Electoral Commission where there's a discrepancy of 20,000 missing postal votes for one of the constituencies. There was a database error this year. I have convinced the Assembly to change the methods for next time because they didn't actually do any recounts. Ask me a question if you want to know more about that. Anyway, this is what democracy looks like, isn't it? These are the people who are tellers. These are the people who observe elections. They ask for your card number when you go to vote. They're the people in the count centre scrutinising the tellers and the counters. And what she said was, it's like sitting at home looking at the back of a television with the sound turned off. The process isn't communicated to us, and most people have no clue about what's going on. It's a shambles. Means no trust in the result because the technology completely interferes with that trust process. Cantering on to Scotland, and I just want to point out, this is really difficult. You've got 1 day to get it right, and it's a transfer of power. So it's not that these people are bad or stupid. It's just really, really hard. So in Scotland, it's e-counting, but the scanners can't take folds. They had to build a special ballot box so that your paper doesn't get folded. Then they take it here to this count centre, and no one knows what the hell anything is. And just a quick cant around, we found all sorts of open ports where we could attack the computers. I could go on. This is one of my favourite slides of all time. So this is a count centre in Scotland, and here, right, is where they're actually counting the ballots. They put it into a machine. Whoop, whoop. Now, where are all the candidates and their agents, right, the people who matter? They're looking at a screen. They're not looking at the counting, and that's just a rolling PowerPoint. I could have put, anything on there, an episode of The Simpsons, and they would watch that because they didn't understand how the count worked. No transparency. In that election, 16 constituencies had more rejected ballots by the scanners than the majority's winner, the winning majority. And no one scrutinised that. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up. Right, David Thompson, MSP, quick summary. He was standing in a constituency, didn't get it, then the regional top-up system in Scotland. They're about to declare it for Labour, and he goes, this doesn't feel right. He physically blocked the returning officer from making the announcement, because once you announce, you have to file an election petition, which costs £5,000. They said, oh, OK, all right, you're so insistent, we're going to have a look. Guess what? They failed to scroll across on the Excel spreadsheet. They'd forgotten the SNP vote, recalculated. He became an MSP for 2 terms. Hoorah. Estonia. Estonia is the only country in the world that uses internet voting for binding parliamentary elections. They're insane because guess what? They are next to Russia. They're a member of the NATO and a member of the European Union. There's a really high benefit of screwing with the Estonian voting system because you get a veto in NATO and in the EU. So it's a big prize, right? Anyway, you can read the full report there. It was peer-reviewed, being published. Fully academic credentialed. It was a team of a bunch of people from Finland, UK, US, University of Michigan. I can prove I was there. That's my card saying I was authorised to observe the election. And we observed loads of stuff. Procedural flaws, basically did stuff wrong and stupid, but also we were able to demonstrate attacks. First attack was we could infect the servers so that we could actually modify the count undetectably. Basically because they used Linux to set up the servers, so we could just dirty the Linux install before they got it. Second one was client goes click, so basically they have a smart card to prove you are who you say you are. We found that there's a way to intercept that on people's computers so that we could vote for them without them knowing. We would do that on their laptop, or even better, going up one level, we do the stealth version where we vote on our own machines elsewhere so they don't even notice it in their browser history. And then they added a verification app, and we discovered that we could spoof that so it looked like your vote was secure and verified when in fact it wasn't. Just an example of procedural security, so they videoed everything they did. They typed in the root password, which is like the master key for the whole system, on camera, so we were able to get that. Then every day they would go and do a check on the system, and they would type in the PIN code for the Master Smart Card to verify the system. So we got the PIN code. But this is really, really hard. They're not stupid. They're really nice people. I've been to Estonia many times to look at this stuff. But they're trying to do the right thing, right? They're putting it on video. They're letting observers in. They're trying to be open. But with technology, it's so hard, because really all I got to see was someone type a PIN code into a computer. There was no trust, and that's a big problem. There's a lack of trust in the system because people don't understand it. So, yeah, I know, I'm out of time. So I don't have time to talk about all these other places, so ask me a question. But Italy, Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, UK, Finland, Norway, Canada have all trialled e-voting and decided it's a really bad idea. So it basically makes no difference to turnout. That's the evidence from around the world. In fact, in the UK trials, turnout went down.
That's not true.
It is. I've got the numbers. The costs are higher. It costs £70 per vote cast in the trials in Sheffield versus £1 per vote cast on paper. The risks are far higher. I can steal 1 million votes like this, so why bother? I could build a hospital with the money. And trust is hard won and easily lost. So why do it? Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. A number have come in who weren't here at the beginning, so let me just go back over what I said. We're now throwing it over to the floor for interventions. We'll take a number. We've guaranteed to each speaker the right to have a decent comeback, so after perhaps 10-15 minutes, I'll invite Areeq to have a comeback on what Jason has said as well as the floor, and then Jason. That's the format. Now the chap at the back and then the chap in the check shirt there. Sorry, before could I just say, first of all, please can you speak up, because we are videoing and recording this. Secondly, if you have any affiliation of any interest or expertise, we here do believe in experts. Any expertise, please declare it. Yes.
No expertise, I'm afraid. Excellent presentation. Could you explain if the current system of postal voting in this country is or isn't more secure than the system you created?
Right. Gentleman in check shirt.
Name's Robert Sprigg, no affiliation. I was a participant in one of those district council elections online, and haven't heard much today about the aspect of the person actually doing the voting. In our household, we arranged each to go into sit in front of the computer one at a time, but there's no guarantee that that's actually going to occur. That it could be all of us in the room at the same time, one person saying, please, that's the way you're going to vote. And so I could see a number of difficulties from that perspective. Now, if I flash forward to the current times, people would expect to be doing it on their mobile device, and I would imagine that they'd be looking at a number of pictures, and they'd be flipping across one way or the other. Whereas even what I was doing on screen took a bit of thinking about, and walking down to the polling station takes a lot of thinking about, whereas just to flip on the screen doesn't take any effort at all, and I'm a little bit concerned about that aspect.
Thank you.
So
Colin, and then chap at the far back, and then you, sir.
Colin Rosenstiel. I first used IT to assist in the counting of elections with a ZX81 in 1981. No, it's 81. For counting the single transferable vote elections, and that's now a fairly developed, well-developed system. I ceased doing programming on it myself some years ago. Handed it over to a professional. The problem is that the distinction between public elections, where trust is far more an important issue than private elections. I've voted online, or I will vote online in the Liberal Democrat election shortly when I get round to it. I've voted in a number of others. The student union in Cambridge, whose votes I counted for 40 years, I got put out of a job by them voting online, because everybody has their own email account with a password, and that's used for security. That's actually quite a good form of security, because people don't share passwords that gives access to their private email in the same way as setting up a password or any other token for public use without any other parallel use. And so many of them vote online that they don't need the help from Electoral Reform Society members like myself anymore. but I always remember a cartoon. I always thought it was Snoopy, but apparently it wasn't. The quote is, "On the internet, no one knows you're a dog." And I regard it as a very helpful reminder to anybody who thinks it's a good idea. It's identification. The point's been raised about postal voting. It's exactly the same problem there. That all these non-personal, in a secured location voting, forms of voting, break down the security that individuals cast their own votes, not under any form of pressure or duress.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real risk with postal voting. There was mention in one of the speeches to the fraud, and a particularly egregious case in Birmingham, which wouldn't have even come to court but for John Hemming, another IT man who's become a politician, having the money to take it to court. It was absolutely scandalous the way the electoral law is supervised in this country. I was also at the county in Edinburgh for the first STD, on electronically counted elections, actually the Scottish Parliament and local government at that stage. And there were a number of fundamental failures in the way the processing was done, and no way of imposing consistency. However, there's only one result where, in my view, and also of Andrew Byrne, my successor as chairman of the Electoral Reform Society and now leader of Edinburgh Council, where that made a difference. And the problem was that the way that results were published, so these are issues little to do with the primary thing. It's actually the organisation of the backup of the IT systems. They didn't give out result sheets in sufficient quantities for people to read them before they left the count, at which point they discovered there's been a margin of only 6 votes between, I think, a Labour and a Conservative candidate. And the way the verification was being done was not good for a margin as close as that, but even if it was for a margin of 50. And so, in looking at the technology here, one also needs to look at the way it's organised. And the trouble, I suspect, is it's done by people who don't have enough understanding of the different aspects of the process. The people doing the checking there aren't party agents who actually understand how tight margins can be, and basic things like scanning. The quality of scanning wasn't good enough in some ballot papers to see what the mark was, and the right way to have dealt with that was to go and find the original piece of paper, but that couldn't be done. And so traceability. I mean, the audit files my programme does for manual copying of ballot papers into data files is more extensive than the example you showed there. It's extraordinary.
Okay. Chap at back and then gentleman in green check shirt.
RF Films and National Tenants Organisations. Particularly for Areeq, and I'm sorry I missed most of your presentation. You may have referred to this. But won't any use really of e-voting now enhance the enormous bias basically towards the upper classes, towards the more prosperous, the more educated, the more metropolitan? And I know people often say, well, the poor have smartphones, but I do a lot of things, various things with housing associations, social housing tenants. And either they don't, or they don't trust them. I mean, it really is the case that the e-wall excludes a lot of the poor, particularly the poor who are on benefits, who are, undervote at the moment. By getting even more of the sort of metropolitan AB groups to vote, making it even easier for them, you're going to enhance that bias we already have to a appalling extent.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm James, I'm local councillor in Newham, and I've also written for WebRoots, so you may think I'm slightly biased, but I'm quite in favour of having electronic voting, simply because it can help reduce duplication. But in terms of postal voting as well,
sort of ready to do a riposte.
Safeguard votes, so there isn't duplication. So if anyone votes via post and they they have the ability to vote online, it doesn't. Their votes are only counted once, whether it's through tagging. But is the system there, and can people be assured that the system actually works?
Thank you. Unless somebody wants to come in, no, nobody is. So, Areeq, would you like to wrap up your views on Jason and
Do you want me to take these questions as well?
and the questions? Yes, and
Okay.
we'll then come back to the audience after Jason's had his turn.
So shall
Yes.
I answer the questions
Yes.
and then make
Yeah,
my pass at the end?
no, bring it together as
Okay,
you
cool.
wish. Entirely up to you how.
So on the questions, the first question I recall was about postal voting, am I correct? And this is important. So the issue with postal voting is that everything that Jason spoke about in his presentation about ways that you can attack, the ways you can attack electronic voting, if you were to do a similar presentation about postal voting, you would find it very, very flawed. You'd find the same about paper ballots. You have people who don't have, so for example, on postal voting specifically, anyone can very easily go up to people's houses and collect postal votes. The easiest election, as a good saying, the easiest election to hack is a paper election. And take examples of recent examples of fraud in elections. In Tower Hamlets, numerous allegations and a proven allegation of postal vote fraud, where they literally went around houses pretending to be from the council and collected up postal votes and filled them in. So there are many flaws in the current system, and that's what one of the quotes, I think it was Gary Davis from Intel Security, was talking about. The current system is not necessarily any more secure than, or any more insecure than online voting. The second question was about using mobile devices, and it being not requiring too much thought. So I'm of the view that voting should be effortless. I don't think it should be something that requires much of a hurdle. I don't think, as well, I don't agree with the idea that there's necessarily more thought in going to a polling station. I think it's very easy to vote in a polling station, if I'm honest. You just go in there, take a piece of paper and stick in a box. I don't think that requires that much thought. So I don't really buy the argument that it's so much easier to do online, therefore that's a danger to how people vote. I mean, and there are other options as well. Some countries use something called repeat voting, and so that's where you have an online election, but you can vote multiple times, and only your last vote counts. And that's to sort of get around things like vote buying and people intimidating you to vote in a certain way. And again, perhaps with that issue about the effortless thought. And the third question was public elections versus private elections, and about them having a high level of trust. In my opinion, I think every election has its own pressures and own high expectations of trust in that result. Take, for example, very recently, the last two Labour leadership elections both had an online option, so you could vote online or you could vote by post. In the first election, 84% of the 400,000 people that voted for when Jeremy Corbyn won, 84% of them voted online, and the most recent election, 90% of them chose to vote online. And that's a very big election, high pressure election. There's no sort of issues around that election. No one's saying, "Oh my God, it's online. We can't have this. Let's dispute the result." Equally, with the Conservative Party leadership election, prior to Andrea Leadsom pulling out, the next Prime Minister was going to be elected online, because the Conservative Party were going to use online voting to decide their next leader of the party and therefore the next Prime Minister. And again, there was no sort of fuss around that issue. It's sort of accepted that that's what they need to do to ensure that as many people as possible participate in that election. And you saw that with the Labour leadership election, which I think was 5 to 10% higher turnout than the prior paper-only vote with Ed Miliband. The next, also on that same question, there was a point about sort of expertise in sort of counting the votes. In the current system, the people who count votes in polling station, when they're counting votes after elections now, don't have any expertise. They don't need a maths qualification. And in fact, often, if you go, I'm sure a lot of you have been to vote counts before, there are many, many recounts, and at the end of the day, you don't know whether a vote is accurate or not, the final amount, because there's so much margin of error. And what does that really mean? That means that not every single vote counts in the current system, purely because of human error. So that, again, is, I think, an important point to think about. Another question on whether it will be biased towards prosperous metropolitan people and disadvantaged the poor. I actually, so I only advocate it as an option. So I don't think it should replace the current system. I think it should complement it. And I also think, so I spend every election day talking to people who aren't voting and finding out why aren't you voting, why didn't you vote, why didn't you care, or things like that. So on the referendum day, for example, I spoke to a gentleman who said he didn't vote in the referendum, even though he himself was very, very passionate about this issue. And he said he works 2 jobs. He didn't have time. He has to He didn't have time to go to a polling station. He works 2 jobs, has to look after his kids. And often the poorest people, especially in London, are working two jobs if you're on a low wage and you have to survive. So I actually think, in a lot of respects, online voting can actually enfranchise people from poor backgrounds. I mean, there's that potential there anyway. I think the final question again was on postal voting, which I think I've covered. But in terms of my sort of reply to Jason's presentation, I found it to be very... one sec. Sorry.
Good.
I found it to be very... Sorry.
Just helping.
Sorry. I found it to be very post-truth. And let me tell you why. I thought it was very Michael Gove-esque. Let me read back something that you said. Let me read back something that you said. You said...
Can you be more insulting?
I know, sorry, I'm sorry. But you said this. At the very beginning, you dismissed the real expert opinions that I had put forward in my presentation. And like I said, I don't disagree that there are risks. But I'm a political scientist and not a computer scientist. I can only really take the advice of people who I believe know much better than me. And these are real experts. On our advisory council, we have 6 leading computer science professors, again, people who are cautious. And to read back a quote that you said, the chair of the Electoral Commission knows nothing about elections.
It's true.
And that's very similar, I think, to the sort of Michael Gove attitude of, that's not true. The chair of the Electoral Commission does not know nothing about elections.
She wasn't appointed to be an expert. She was appointed to chair a board.
But the idea that she knows nothing about elections is frankly not true. And that's what I feel to be a very post-truth idea, because it's very similar to sort of what Michael Gove is saying, is that people have had enough about experts, so let's not listen to them. So I've set out how many experts across the world in security and politics and involved in elections have said that this can be done. They accept that there are risks. And I think what you do is really important in highlighting them. And I often go back to people with the points that you make and say, what about this, what about that? But the idea, I still go back to that first point, we shouldn't take a doomsday attitude towards this. There are so many projects. If you were to apply the same level of scrutiny to any other project, if you were to apply the same level of scrutiny to the current methods of voting, you would find so many flaws that make you distrust that method of election. The reality is, if today we had no democracy and tomorrow we were going to design a system of democracy, it would look nothing like the current system. I would guarantee it would have at least some element of digital involvement in that. So, but I appreciate everything you say, are valid points, and I think that should form a important part of the future debate towards ensuring online voting happens, rather than arguing that it's completely impossible.
Okay.
Right, Jason?
I'm going to rise above that. So, first of all, people did dispute the Corbyn result both times. And I think one of the problems I had with being a member of the Electoral Reform Society is their subsidiary profits massively from these online votes, and there is a massive conflict of interest for them. Moving swiftly on. And also, the problem with using those examples, like the Corbyn election, is they aren't anything like a national politically binding elections. For example, they don't run polling stations across every polling district, and so the comparison of the turnout of online votes versus paper votes is different, because it was all paper ballots through post was the alternative beforehand, and that was massively expensive because you have to pay for the postage out and back. And so there's a lot of work done to say, can you save our costs and vote online, please? And Nationwide and all these people do the same thing. Secondly, preventing duplication, the question about whether, if someone could vote by postal vote and then that could be discarded if they voted online, that was one of the challenges the pilots in 2007 looked at. None of that is possible without a real-time electoral roll that is national, provides national coverage, so that someone who casts a vote through one channel is marked as having voted elsewhere. That didn't succeed during those trials, and there have been 2 attempts since then by government called Core and Laser, both of which have failed. The only place in the world which does this is Estonia, but they already have a national ID card system and an entire a thing called the data spine through which all their government services work. However, moving on to the next point about family voting is a massive problem with all remote forms of voting, including postal voting and online voting. The way Estonia get around it is allowing you to cast multiple votes. So if your boss or your partner stands over your shoulder and tells you to vote a certain way, you can go and vote another day in the library, and only your most recent vote counts. That was also the loophole which allowed us to cast votes without your knowledge, because the first time you did it, our attack captured your PIN code and we re-voted. So what is a defense against one thing actually opens an attack vector for another thing. So the question on postal voting, is it more secure than online voting? Yes, but it's still not secure. And I've been a long-term critic of postal voting as well, particularly all postal voting. So in Brighton, there was a trial of every voter in the city getting a postal vote, whether they asked for it or not, which is massively insecure because, as was alluded to, you can just go around and harvest those postal votes. A permanent opt-in to postal votes is also a bad thing in my view. I think you should have to request it on a per-election basis with good reason, which was the system as it was before, and that would minimise risk. Certainly, I've never suggested the current system is perfect, nor have I suggested that it is without risk or error, but the scope of the fraud and error is limited. We've just all cited examples where people were actually prosecuted for fraud and they were caught, and the reasons they were caught were because it is a paper-based system and people were caught with the securely marked bits of paper when they shouldn't have had them. Are there errors? Yes. Is there human error? Yes, of course. But the fact is, when you have a count where you've got agents from umpteen parties and candidates watching bundles, the level of fraud is limited to plus or minus sort of 10, 15 votes because you can see where the bundles are and watch them. And the paper is hard to move. As I said, in Birmingham, where Richard Morey, the election court judge, said it was equivalent to a banana republic, the fraud they were attempting, quite memorably. They were caught with the papers. So that is a protection there, whereas, as I've pointed out, electrons are invisible to the human eye. And I would point out that if we are going to get into sort of waving our experts around, to coin a phrase, the Association for Computing Machinery, which is the International Association of Computer Scientists, the British Computer Science, and pretty much every professor of computer science in Ivy League and Oxford universities are all opposed to the introduction of electronic voting. And these are people whose careers depend on technology. I am a technologist. I've worked in e-democracy and e-government for many years, but e-voting is one where the risk-benefits don't add up. So finally, to the benefits, the question we need to ask ourselves is why people vote or choose not to vote. And most of the studies done so far show that the reasons why people choose not to vote is because they believe all candidates are the same, the results are foregone conclusion, their vote doesn't make a difference, they don't know enough about what's going on with the issues, and none of those things are solved by e-voting. Yes, you'll always be able to find the example of someone who's in the wrong place at the wrong time who couldn't vote. There are ways that we could improve that. With a national electoral register, for example, someone could cast a vote in a different polling station to their own. And that is what's done in many other parts of the world. These are soluble problems. The problem when you get to online voting is you're opening up your election system to attack by global actors. And that is undetectable. And that is the problem. So we have seen already in the US the repeated suggestions of actions by foreign agents, i.e. Russia, China, so on. And the problem isn't proving whether they did or didn't do it. The problem is proving whether they didn't. And so that means Trump can send tweets like that, and it creates the seeds of doubt. And that is really, really corrosive on the trust in the democratic system. And the point of elections is a peaceful transfer of power. And that's why they evolved the way they are. Are they perfect? No, of course not. But they are the way they are for good reason, through many, many hard-fought years of trying to ensure free and fair elections that don't get stolen.
Thank you. Any other? No, here, we've so far had 100% gender imbalance. Is there anybody volunteering to put that one right? Okay, so start here and then I'll move around. Yes.
Hi, Jason, I think to pick up on that theme of quotations
Yeah.
from this session, elections are the way they are for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's been said so many times the last, 200, 300, 400 years in this country, when we didn't have secret ballots, when women couldn't vote. I mean, do you really think in 150 years' time that we're still going to be debating this? Do you not just feel that the tide of history is against you? And I think to conflate why don't people vote and put the burden of sort of evidence or proof on e-voting to solve that problem is conflating two very separate issues. Areeq isn't arguing that it's 100% safe or cheap. And I think to meld those issues together is to do a disservice to this debate.
Okay. Here, I just move around a little.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Fran.
John, I'd like to really reinforce two of the points that Jason Kitcat made. I mean, I used this to vote in the Labour leadership contest twice, And notwithstanding the fact that I didn't support Jeremy Corbyn on either occasion, I have no reason to doubt that there was any discrepancy in the outcome. However, particularly that's when we're talking about the general elections, whatever, I do worry that there will be a very real fear of the level of intimidation that one's seen in the postal ballot system. And that was outside the privacy of a polling station. Even with an ancient stubby pencil, I believe there's a very real risk of intimidation. And that obviously is very difficult to quantify. The other point, which was also made earlier, is frankly the danger of hacking. I'll rest my case.
Yes.
David Palmer, Millbank Partners. Jason, we tend to ridicule what Trump says, but given that, as I understand it, there's been a dramatic increase in postal voting, and also I think they use automatic counting machines, because otherwise how do they get the result out so quickly? Maybe he's right. Can you comment on that?
Moving backwards, yes.
Jason, the thing that just occurs to me, I mean, you've raised all these technical problems. Let's say, I mean, these technical problems are obviously important. Let's say we overcome these technical difficulties. Would you be in favor of electronic voting if we overcome these problems? I say this because, I mean, these e-petitions, which are extremely popular. I think there's often criticism that people in their having their coffee break or whatever come across these petitions and start just taking them off one after the other. But still, it gives an idea that actually the idea that an individual can actually make a difference, whatever the difference might be, is an incredibly powerful aspect to our democracy. It sort of adds to the health of democracy. Even if people haven't fully formed their opinions and ideas, the fact that someone can make some difference in the world is a powerful incentive. And I think in a way, that's why your colleague, I'm agreeing with him, that I think in a way, agreeing with people who say that that even an instinctive way of approaching this should be encouraged.
Yeah. And behind you?
My name is David Melville. I'm a director of the world's largest electronic voting company, which ironically is based here in London. And I'm something of a technology advocate. Listening to Jason reminded me back in 2000 when I was at a company that I helped launch called Freezer. And I went to see BT, and I asked BT for access to their servers, their broadband servers. Ben Bowen was the chief executive at the time, and he looked at us and he said, why did anybody want broadband? Why on earth do you think people are going to want to have speeds of 1 megabyte per second? Don't be ridiculous. We're not going to give you access to that. To our terminals, go away. We have to sue them, actually, to get access. The issue of what we did back in 2007 being used to form the basis of a critique of the way in which technology presently deals with the question of security, verifiability, and anonymity is a very poor way of advancing the UK's approach to technology. And the frustration that I share, and I think much of the industry shares,
Most of the questions are clearly directed, so I'd probably bring him in first, then give you the final word.
I find myself looking at two sort of bookends. And on the one side of the bookend is the advocate for online voting, who will do anything to get to get us voting online. And at the other end of the bookend is the political or computer scientist for whom to advance any question of technology into the field of voting is seen as a complete anathema. And what is always missing from the debate is anybody who can actually tell you what electronic voting presently now does, and what it looks like. The question of voting turnout and voter turnout also is not frankly a lawyer, and I'm a member of the Law Society's Technology and Law Reference Group, looking at issues like privacy, for example, and the way in which data sharing is being blocked through privacy arguments is something that we're looking at very deeply at the moment as well. But in the context of voting, it's not about turnout. It's about participation. It's about the fact that if you're disabled, actually, and you're remote, you can vote and participate. It's the fact that if you're partially sighted, you have the capacity to vote independently, not with somebody giving you a plastic folder over which you can put some kind of braille constructed voting mechanism in London. It's about if you have some form of mental capacity, mental incapacity, and you're faced with a ballot like the London GLE elections, which are confusing, not easy to understand, but which through technology can be made far more accessible. It's nothing to do with turnout, it's about participation itself. But fundamentally, and forgive me for going on like this, what I miss in all of these debates is somebody who would say, you know what, this is what it looks like, this is how it works, this is how much money it can save. As Areeq said, it's not the panacea. And as Jason says, yes, there are susceptibilities, but don't drag me back to Slam 2007. It's not in 20.
Those were good times.
Well, may I personally thank you very much for that well-informed intervention. Second go from the back. Anybody? I'll take the person over there first, and then, yes.
Phil Thompson from the Electoral Commission. I think this is a variation of the theme, but I just wanted to, just to be clear, I think what Areeq is saying is we couldn't turn it on tomorrow, but we should look at it. And I think what Jason is saying is we couldn't turn it on tomorrow, and we shouldn't ever try. But that's exactly what I was wondering. Is that what you meant, or do you mean a bit like various questions in this round of ask? It wouldn't work today or tomorrow or in a year's time. That's no reason not to think about it and overcome some of the issues. And then if those can be overcome, because actually in Areeq's presentation on one of the quotes I think was around high-speed rail. Well, you probably would have asphyxiated in high-speed rail in 1800 because there weren't any roofs on the trains. But you put a roof on the train, and it's fine. I just wondered if, just to be really clear, what Jason's argument is it let's fix the problems and then do it, or this is just a bad idea from the start, let's not bother and all go wrong.
Well, Jason will answer that in just a moment. I've got one more lined up, and then I'll make you the final intervention. Then I'll say something myself. Then, Jason, most of the questions are directed at you, so have the time you need, and Areeq will have the final word. Yes, at the back.
Areeq, thank you for your answer. But 2 points on your answer. This chap with 2 jobs. When you dig down into the group that's not voting, it's not poverty that's the real predictor. It's that they're unemployed or not working, disabled, housekeeping, whatever, but particularly unemployed. And when we've just experienced the Brexit vote and indeed Donald Trump's elections, perhaps it's parallel, where you have what I like to call the weird side phenomena. There's an awful lot of people there feeling remote from the whole society, really, because they don't have jobs and so on and so forth. They turned out to vote in Brexit to give us metropolitan liberal blah 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 a bloody nose. It wasn't. It's not because they don't have time to vote. It's because they're not inclined to vote. And as I say, the second point on that is, I think you're missing what I'm saying is the problem with this. Yes, by having e-voting and whatnot, I suspect you will get more people voting in certain categories. The problem, and I don't know how you get around this, but the problem is you will get more of the people who are already disproportionately voting. That's what I'm trying to get across, and therefore you will enhance this huge imbalance in our electoral system, where sadly the non-working, unemployed, etc., are not voting for representative democracy. They're more, they're not responding to it because they see representatives as all the same as Jason's remark.
Thank you. If I may make a point myself, or a group of points, I'm not going to try and sum up this debate. But to me, it's been very interesting, as raised a range of problems, and I'd like perhaps to pull one or two together and also plumb into some of the work that I know has been done in the past, such as the many Electoral Commission experiments on trying to increase turnout. I don't think the issue, seriously, is a significant effect on the level of turnout. The level of turnout has been dropping in all Western democracies at differing rates and for different elections, but for large societal and profound reasons. No change in the electoral system or in ways of voting will make a lot of difference to that. It could make marginal difference. The issues, therefore, are efficacy at enabling individuals or particular groups to participate, and that seems to me there have been quite a few interesting points made on both sides. And then, perhaps more substantially, because it affects everybody, the linked issues of the efficiency of the system, which is clearly improvable from systems used to date, of security, and perhaps most of all, trust. And trust in our institutions is clearly at risk. So with that closing remark from me,
Thank you.
Jason, wrap up from your side and then over to Areeq.
I'll do my best. I think the first thing is just, I wanted to reflect that we're in such a better place than we were in 98, 99 when I started looking at this, because back then there was no Electoral Commission. There was no independent place to actually start reviewing these changes and opportunities and risks and benefits. And so one shouldn't underestimate the fact that having an independent commission to accredit observers and to write independent reports on this has changed the dynamic in the UK significantly, and things have moved on. So in 2007, as was mentioned, the Scottish elections had local elections and Scottish parliamentary elections at the same time, which was a disaster, and the commission was very strong on that, and they have been split apart since then. So there is progress in terms of making things better, and it's so much better now that it's not all hosted within the Home Office as elections once were many moons ago. So let's welcome that progress. On the point of, the gentleman at the back was saying about, is this going to get more rich people voting? I mean, that is not my argument against it, but I just know that in Estonia that is what happened in part of the political debate, that it tends to be older people who are voting through the online system, and there are also ethnic splits on there. So ethnic Russians tend not to use the system. Why? I could be here for hours on why, but it's interesting and one of the things that splits down party lines in Estonia. On the comments about, let's not go back to 2007, fair enough, but we do have short memories, and a lot of people don't know that we spent £100 million trying this stuff in the UK. And it is worth noting that there were very big companies doing that, Microsoft, Oracle, Accenture, so on. So these weren't, pipsqueaks. So none of them election companies. A lot of them bought the dot-coms trying to be election companies, though. So, and a lot of them are still trading and providing services to London elections and to Scottish elections and so on, which moves me on. The Estonia example is from 2013, and that system is still live now, though there's a new coalition as of a few weeks who have promised in their new coalition agreement to review the security of that system. And London, as of this year, I didn't have time to go into it, but the reason there was a delay in announcing Sadiq Khan as mayor was because there was a serious problem with the database, a bug which had actually existed for 8 years but hadn't been noticed. And they discovered that the returning officer for all of London does not have the power to require a recount of the ballots, which is a bit of an oversight, only the local constituency returning officers. And so their audit of that was to do another query of the database, not a check of the actual voter intention. So one can go, oh yeah, back then was bad, which is a classic vendor play, if I might say. But actually this is really, really hard because it's a single time to get it right. And we know computers are really complicated and difficult things to manage. And the argument that the technology hasn't moved on, has moved on significantly just isn't true. All the leading providers like Cycle and Everyone Counts, and I know them all, their basic platforms have not moved on. It is the same model. We can talk afterwards, but the basic paradigm hasn't changed. The basic paradigm hasn't changed. On the issue of disabled voting, I think this is a very important issue, and Scope and RNIB have got some really valid points on that. The problem is that if you're going to build a whole infrastructure for online voting for a few, suddenly it goes, well, why not make it for the many? If you do it for the few, then they get the benefit of them, but they probably lose their anonymity because there are too few people using the system, so you can figure out who did it. And it becomes a slippery slope to opening up the risks to everyone. On the idea, the seductive idea of everyone can make a difference, totally, and that's why I'm passionate about e-democracy. And when I was leader, I spent a lot of time and energy using online tools to involve people in online budget setting and so on. But I don't think it's the technology that makes a difference. With my experiments as leader, we had greater participation in offline meetings with budget experts talking about the council budget than the online element. And the international idea, a think tank on this, have got interesting data showing the more proportional your voting system, the higher the turnout over time. So one might argue if you wanted to do a technocratic change, let's make our voting system more proportional and we get higher engagement because people would know their vote makes more of a difference. But there are others here more qualified to talk on that. I would say I'm not standing against the tide of history and I'm not ruling it out ever, but I'm saying within the levels of technology as it stands today, you cannot create a secure, verifiable and anonymous voting system that is satisfactory for politically binding national and local elections. That's what I'm saying. If you choose to do it for your private elections, your membership bodies, fine, there's a risk-cost trade-off there. But let's remember the CIA, NSA, US Navy, UK Navy, TK Maxx, Boots, you name it. They've all been hacked. They've all suffered massive data leaks. And they have billions resting on that not happening. So if all of them are unable to keep their data secure, why is a voting system that gets used once every few years going to be any better off? It's, and PhDs have been spent on this. It's an NP hard problem in computer science terms. And Ron Rivest, who's seen as the father of cryptography, feels that it's not something that can be done with modern technology. If you want to look into this in more detail, I'd suggest you look at Norway's work. They did a fantastic multi-year project into this, building a system from scratch, trialing it, doing loads of research documents, and they came to the conclusion the risks weren't worth the minuscule rewards. So in response to the Electoral Commission question, am I saying never? No, but I'm saying there's a long road ahead. I think at some time in the future, maybe with quantum cryptography or something like that, we'll be able to do it at a risk-reward trade-off. But right here and now, if I put a slightly political head on, we're in austere times. Do we really want to spend money on this? Or are there other ways we could spend the money for far better, greater benefit to the public good? My argument would the money could be better spent elsewhere.
Thank you. Areeq.
So, first of all, I'll just try and adjust that point. I've got to be honest with you, I don't know that much about the sort of factors that are involved in terms of unemployed and lower income people voting. But what I will say is that there's still a bias against, in the current system, there's still a bias against people with disabilities and vision impairments. So there are different people that will benefit. I mean, I don't know, if I'm honest, about whether it will be the metropolitan elite who will benefit the most out of this. Just to make a few more general points, I forgot to mention earlier, so the Electoral Commission report, when they looked at this, didn't actually say to not do online voting. It said to look at it again when we have individual electoral registration, which we do have now, which is also, by the way, online voter registration, which in my opinion is actually way more sensitive information that we're transmitting across the internet in terms of your name, date of birth, national insurance number, where you live, than actual voting. And sort of linked to that point is that this would not be the most sensitive thing that's on the internet at the moment. So I mentioned that I'm an auditor. One of the things I look at is housing benefit audits, and that is basically looking at local councils and checking whether they're paying the right amounts to certain claimants. And on their online systems, you have their name, date of birth, their email address, their ethnicity, where they live, their pay slips, their family, their spouse name, their children's name. This is not the most sensitive thing that will be on the internet. It wouldn't be such a radical change. And in terms of sort of identity, there's a lot of work that's being done by the government. It's called GovUK Verify, and that's so you can do things like pay your tax online, apply for a passport online, and your driving license, and lots of other things that they're moving towards, and being able to do it securely and so that you can verify your identity. And again, to sort of reiterate that point I made at the end of my presentation, the real risk and danger in our democracy is that people don't vote at all. And that's the reality. I mean, general elections and referendums are one thing. And by the way, on the referendum, still 13 million people didn't vote, which I think, with all the money that went into it and the long campaign, I think is an area that should be looked at. And to give you an example, recently, a couple of years ago, the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner by-election had a turnout of 10%. Some polling stations had no one turn up at all. And the idea that sort of China or Russia are going to hack a West Midlands PCC by-election, I think, is unlikely. Yeah, and also to sort of touch on that point, I do think in 100 years' time we will have online voting. I don't think in 100 years' time we'll have like I said, people are growing up as digital natives now, probably never posted a letter in their life. 100 years' time, I can't even imagine what the world will be like, or how much more advanced it'll be. I can't imagine, though, that we'll be, trotting along to a polling station or putting stuff into envelopes. I don't even know if envelopes will exist anymore. And Jason said, he doesn't think it's impossible. He thinks there's a long road ahead. And I think, therefore, that we should really start the car and get onto that long road ahead and come together and get people working together to make it work, because I do think there are benefits. Even if it doesn't roll out to everyone, there are still marginalised groups in our society who could benefit from this. And that is the most important thing in a democracy. It's the fundamental building block is that people participate in the most basic method possible, which is voting at elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you to both. We're now closing of the final. Yes?
May I ask if Parliament has actually debated this subject?
No.
No, is the answer.
So clearly there hasn't been an e-petition on it then?
That's a challenge. There hasn't been an e-petition on this subject which has got sufficient signatures in order to ensure a parliamentary debate. There might have been one which didn't reach that target. In closing this final workshop of 2016, can I first of all endorse one point that Jason made? As a retired political scientist, I think on behalf of myself and many others in the political science community, we would want to say that the Electoral Commission, for all the fact that there are one or two mistakes it has made, has improved the quality of the understanding and supervision of electoral processes. And since some criticisms have been made, let me make that personally clear. And secondly, if I may be allowed, Jason is absolutely right to say that there is a relationship. The more proportional electoral system is, the higher the turnout. It's not a massive difference, but it is there. And I think it is fairly simply that the more people know their vote will matter, the more they are likely to vote. And it's of a part and parcel that turnout is higher in marginal seats than in safe seats in the United Kingdom. That's the effect.
And are you aware of the effect in the referendum, that there was a substantial proportion of the turnout didn't vote in the general election?
Yes.
In the referendum
Because people felt their vote would count wherever they lived, whereas under the American Electoral College system or the British constituency system, whether it was AV or at first past the post, enough people knew their vote wouldn't count in large parts of the country. That is the effect there. Anyway, sorry, that's got into detail. For the future, there will be McDougall Trust workshops next year. They might be in the current format. They might even have me as chair once again, and they might be in this venue. But we are expecting to launch a new series, and until that is sorted out and an announcement is made, I can't now announce our next workshop. I hope all of you are on our email information list. Anybody who's not enabled to receive information about our workshops, please have a word with Paul at the back. And make sure that when we hold the first workshop next year, you know in advance, and if you want to come, you can. Many thanks indeed for attending, and many thanks for our two speakers for such a civilised and well-informed debate.
Thank you.